Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the luncheon organized by Hong Kong Policy Research Institute and Newton Yewa Education Network. The luncheon will start in 2 minutes. Please switch your mobile phone to silent mode. Thank you. We have also arranged a simultaneous interpretation from English to Mandarin. If you wish to have a headset, please raise your hand. 各位来宾您好，欢迎出席由香港政策研究所及耀中耀华教育网络举办的午餐会。午餐会即将开始，请将您的手提电话换至静音模式，谢谢。我们同时也有安排普通话翻译，如果有需要的话，请举手。Today, we're delighted to have Mr. Paul Tse, JP Solicitor, Executive Deputy Chairman, Hong Kong Policy Research Institute, and member of Legislative Council of Hong Kong, give the opening remarks as well as our facilitator for the Q&A session. Mr. Tse has close to 40 years of practicing experience as a barrister and solicitor. He has been a member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong since 2008, initially for the Tourism Functional Constituency, and since 2012 for the Kowloon East Geographical Constituency, and since 2021 for the Electoral Constituency. Now may I invite Mr. Tse to come up on the stage. Mr. Tse, please.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick advertisement about the Hong Kong Policy Research Institute before I start. The Institute is a non-profit making and independent public policy think tank set up in 1995 in anticipation of China's resumption of sovereignty over Hong Kong in 1997. The primary objective of the HKPRI is to contribute through conducting public researches and publishing effective and pragmatic proposals and recommendations towards the successful implementation of the one country, two systems in Hong Kong. So much for the introduction. Now let's come back to our talk today, to the speaker today. To fully comprehend the accomplishments of our honorable speaker today, and in particular the wisdom and insights behind these accomplishments, I think we have to go back to a bit of history. Professor Mahbubani, Kishore Mahbubani, he prefers us to address him as Kishore, so I will do that. Kishore was born in 1948 to two Hindu Sindhi parents who were forced in 1947 to move from Pakistan to Singapore. At that time, there was this split between Hindu India and Islamic Pakistan. In Singapore, where he was born and bred, he had the opportunity of learning from really great masters, like he mentioned in his books, including, of course, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and S. Rajaratnam. And from these mentors, Kishore learned to formulate any long-term strategy, to frame the right questions. That is the first step. And I believe it's Mr. Rajaratnam who told him, in formulating these questions, you have to think the unthinkable. And in Kishore's own words, he has this unusual cultural quirks. He has this cultural connections with diverse societies in Asia, where half of humanity lives, from Tehran to Tokyo. He's connected with over 1 billion Hindus in South Asia. 9 out of 10 South Asian states have Indic cultural base. And as a child, Kishore read and learned stories from the Ramayana, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and the Mahabharata, two major Sanskrit epics of ancient India, the importance of which is comparable in the context of world civilization to the Bible, the Quran, works of Homer, or works of Shakespeare. He also learned to read and write Sindhi with Perso-Arabic script, and therefore acquired this connection with the Iranian culture. And indeed, the name Mahbubani It's from the root word Mabu, meaning the beloved. And he also acquired this cultural affinity with China, Korea, Japan, via Buddhism, which, as we all know, has its roots in Hinduism and was originated in India. And Kishore, as a child, was often taken to pray in Buddhist and Hindu temples. Now, about his academic background, as we all know, he's got his BA, having first honor, in the National University of Singapore, where he studied philosophy. And from this discipline, Kishore said he acquired the skill and practice of breaking down a major question into smaller questions all the time. He had his Master of Arts in Philosophy also from the Dalhousie University in Canada. And in 1991 to 92, he was fellow of the Center for International Affairs at Harvard. And from 2004 to 2017, he was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. One would imagine a university or an institute named after a living icon than the sort of pressure that Kishore would have had. And in 2019, he was a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, or he became a member. And after his academic studies, he launched into a lifelong career in diplomacy. And he became a career diplomat during the years from 1971 to 2004, almost like 33 years. He had postings in Malaysia, in Cambodia during the wartime days, in fact, 1973 to 74, and in Washington, D.C. And in 84 to 89, he was the ambassador to the United Nations. And after that, he went back to Singapore and served as the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1998, he had his second stint as ambassador to the UN, and indeed, in 2001 to 2002, he was president of the United Nations Security Council. So altogether, he had 10 years in the UN. And incidentally, I think he mentioned his first visit to China was 1980, when China was beginning to have its open policies and reform. And since then, he's been back to China for many, many times, over 30 times, I guess. Yeah. And about, after Kishore having this illustrious career in international diplomacy, he went back to Singapore and started to establish the Lee Kuan Yew School of, that we mentioned about, and began writing substantively and substantially. He wrote book after book, 9 in 10 years, I believe, with his very first one in 2001, while still being the UN Security Council president. A very provocative name, Can Asia Think? And Kishore likes to joke about it and say maybe in one of the next books I can use the title, Can Asia Joke? In 2008, this is another very provocative book that he wrote, which is called the New Asian Hemisphere. In fact, it's written during the time when he was dean to the Lee Kuan Yew School. And in the introduction of the book, we have references to comments made about his book, such as the anti-Western polemic by The Economist. That was a time when the West is still very hostile to Kishore's writing, of course. And in fact, in Kishore's own words, he said, out of sheer folly for me to write this book while I was building a new school of public policy. And there he said he was looking forward to normal life, to play golf again on weekends after that book. But, you know, sometimes we do not plan our everything. So in the one that really had a big hit in his publication is the one in 2020, which is called Has China Won? The title of which, is, of course, is very provocative. And in fact, Kishore has the practice of having these books in a question mark form, so asking the right questions, asking the provocative questions all the time. And in fact, it's a very interesting book full of interesting anecdotes, including the one I find very interesting. It's the one that Kishore was having lunch, one-on-one lunch, sometime in March 2018 with Dr. Henry Kissinger in a midtown Manhattan restaurant on a snowy, stormy day, all the details. And it was then and there that Kishore was alerted to one big strategic mistake made by the US administration. And that was the launching in 2018 of the contest with China without first developing a comprehensive and global strategy to deal with China. And in fact, this big message is featured prominently in Kissinger's later book on China. And in this book, we learn about comments or observations like the textures and chemicals of the world have changed, of which most Americans are not aware. And reference was made to the, out of the 193 national states in UN, which country, whether it's the US or China, is swimming in the same direction as the majority of the other 191 countries? Good question. And he said, in the era of nuclear weapons, superpower primacy is likely to be determined in the economic sphere, not military sphere. Reminds us of Bill Clinton's electoral slogan, is the economy stupid? And provocatively, Kishore said in his book that if he were asked to advise President Xi Jinping on what to do with this competition with the US, and one of his prominent answers, overestimate rather than underestimate the American strengths. And the objective of the book, as it were, is to blow away the thick fog of misunderstanding that has enveloped the Sino-American relationship. And to borrow the words of Sun Tzu, know your enemy and know yourself. You need not fear the result of 100 wars. And obviously, the Americans not doing the right thing, taking heed of Kishore's observations. And in this latest open access publication, free-for-all publication, the Asian 21st Century, we find very interesting subheadings or topics, very provoking, including of special interest to Hong Kong people here, perhaps. Hong Kong people must understand they've become a pawn of football in the book. And there was this comment that Hong Kong never developed the art of managing political disputes. Other topics include why the Indian way may be the world's best bet for moral leadership. And also, this heading, can India become stronger than China? Yes, it can. You're going to hear Kishore telling us why. And in fact, instead of framing the contest or competition between US and China as being one of democracy versus autocracy, Kishore believes that it is really a question of plutocracy versus meritocracy. And it's really a question of development of the Chinese culture, which is the US is up against, not just the Communist Party itself. The CCP, Kishore suggests, should read, instead of Chinese Communist Party, should read Chinese Civilization Party. Now, a quick rundown on Kishore's honors list before I go. 1995, he's honorary Doctor of Philosophy of Dalhousie University. 2019, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as I mentioned before. He is now a distinguished the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore, a name card that Kishore carries around these days. And in 2005, he was listed as top 100 public intellectuals in the world by the, as we all know, famous Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines. 2010 to 11, he was listed top 100 global thinkers of the Foreign Policy magazine again. 2014, top 50 world thinkers of the Prospect magazine. And in that connection, I was wondering whether Kishore might like to consider becoming an honorary professor in Hong Kong, seeing that Jack Ma has just become one, and to bring his real experience to his courses. Now, before I welcome Kishore to the stage, let me quote from him again. Prime Minister or former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, used to say, or advise the world, look east. Prime Minister Narendra Modi advised the world, act east. Kishore advised the world, learn from the east. And as an avatar of the Renaissance of the East, if I put it that way, we look forward to having Kishore to keep reminding us not only to think the unthinkable, but also to speak the unspeakable. Now let's welcome Kishore Mahbubani, the beloved professor and ambassador, to the stage. Thank you very much.
I must say that that's by far the most comprehensive introduction I have ever had about my life, and I'm very happy to discover things about my life I'd forgotten, especially things I had said. But thank you, Paul. That was a very warm and generous welcome. I also want to thank Professor Paul Yip and Mrs. Betty Chan for hosting me here. I've been amazed by the hospitality I get to Hong Kong every time I come. I'm glad that the COVID nightmare is over. And I better warn you, I'm going to come to Hong Kong very often and share my thoughts with you. Now, I also understand that I stand between you and lunch. And you know, if you give a former UN ambassador a microphone, before you know it, 3 hours have passed. So your lunch was coming at 3:30, I guess. No, I will be brief. I'll try to speak for about 30 minutes or so and share with you my thoughts on this question. Can China outcompete the US? And frankly, as you all know, this is the biggest question of our time. There is absolutely no doubt that the US-China contest will accelerate over the next 10 years. This is a certainty. What we don't know, of course, is going to be the outcome. Therefore, it's important for us, psychologically, politically, to prepare for this contest, and also to see what we can do to mitigate it in some ways. So what I propose to do in my remarks is I'll divide them into 3 parts. In part 1, I'll first try to explain why this contest will accelerate. 2, what are the relative strengths of China and the US in this competition? And I want to add that not since human history began have you had 2 powers of the size, scale, and of China and the United States competing with each other. This is the greatest geopolitical struggle since human history began. And then, of course, as I said, I'll try and conclude by saying what can we do to mitigate this contest. So let me begin in part 1. Why am I confident that this contest will accelerate? Because there are deep structural forces driving this contest. And the first one is, of course, what I call the iron law of geopolitics, which has been around for 2,000, 3,000 years, which is that whenever the world's number 1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number 1 power, which today is the United States of America, the world's number 1 power always pushes down the world's number 1 emerging power. And it happens time and time again. And you know, I was actually in the US, Paul, a few weeks ago, and I went back to my old hunting grounds in Harvard, and I met Professor Graham Allison again, a friend of mine. And as you know, he's written a book called Destined for War, which explains why throughout history the established powers will push down the rising powers. And so what the United States, therefore, is doing in trying to stop China from becoming number one is predictable behavior. But the only question is whether or not it's rational behavior. And here we assume that we as human beings are now so well educated. We have bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, and we think that we no longer behave like primitive animals, that we can rise above our animal instincts and learn to live with peace with one another. And the shocking thing is that when it comes to geopolitics, all that intelligence and sophistication disappears, and you get raw power contests coming out. And to me, I was just in the US a few weeks ago, as I said, it's actually quite striking since I wrote the book in 2020, where I actually predicted. I said, this contest will accelerate. I said it when I was writing it 4 years ago. But even having predicted it, I was still surprised by the intensity of the conviction in the United States that China must be stopped. And we can discuss that in the Q&A as to what's driving this very strong conviction. And it's not just gripped the establishment, it's now gripped popular opinion, and you can have little accidents can make a difference. As you know, earlier this year, a balloon drifted into the United States. I told myself, what's the big deal? A balloon has only got hot air, so what damage can it do? But actually, to my surprise, when I was in the US a few weeks ago, balloon did a lot of damage, because what to many ordinary Americans was a distant threat over there, China. Suddenly, for 24 hours a day, they were watching TV, and they saw this balloon over American skies, and they said, China is no longer over there, China is over here, watching us. So the psychological impact of Balloon Gate, I completely underestimated. And as a result of it, the surveys now show that popular opinion against China within the US body politic is at an all-time high. And when I spoke to a very senior former policymaker about the US-China contest, he said, Kishore, today in the US, the Democrat policymakers or lawmakers and the Republican lawmakers are leapfrogging over each other to say, I am more anti-China than you. I am more anti-China than you. And no one says, I am pro-China. Or even that there may be a different course on China. That's why you can see, I believe, that this contest will accelerate. But at the same time, in addition to what I call the iron law of geopolitics, as you can tell watching the debates on US-China in the media and elsewhere, there is an emotional dimension to it, which is very difficult to speak about because it's politically incorrect to speak about it, but at the same time, it's real. And this emotional dimension is what I call the fear of the yellow peril in the Western imagination. People don't speak about it, but it's real. And if anyone doubts it, as I document in my book, Has China Won? The United States Congress actually passed a law called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act in the 1890s. I recently learned that act was only repealed in the 1940s. For 50 years, there was an act called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. So it's there, that emotional dimension. And then also there is the ideological dimension to this contest that's also driving it. Because the Americans believe, I must say, with a lot of sincere conviction, that their mission is to protect democracy in the world. And if a non-democratic regime emerges and succeeds, they don't just see it as a threat to democracy in the United States, they see it as a threat to democracy globally. And that's why Joe Biden portrays it as a democracy versus autocracy contest. And of course, by framing it that way, it's also one way of getting popular support from the American public, because they believe that their mission is also to defend democracy. And so it's a combination of all these forces means that there is no doubt that this contest will accelerate. But what's interesting, and this brings me to part 2 of my remarks, is that even though the United States has launched this contest to stop China from overtaking the US, no one has actually asked whether or not, this is why, as you said, Paul, I got this insight from Henry Kissinger, the United States actually doesn't have a comprehensive strategy on how to deal with China, and the actions that are taken are often not consistent, and sometimes they don't seem to be part of a coherent strategy. But despite that, there is no doubt that the United States is a formidable actor. In fact, the United States is clearly the most powerful society that humanity has created since human history began. The scope and power of the United States is amazing. And that's why in my book, in my fictional memo to President Xi Jinping, I say it's better for the United States better for China to overestimate the United States rather than underestimate the United States. And I'll try to explain why as we go down the various dimensions of this contest. Now, you all know that this contest is multi-dimensional, and the most obvious area where you might expect this contest to accelerate, and that's the way actually it has happened since human history began. Most great powers, when they want to resolve a contest, at the end of the day, choose to do it on the military battlefield. And frankly, until about the World War II, whenever there was a big contest between two great powers, at the end of the day, it would erupt into a military conflict, and whoever won the military conflict would have won, right? But today, this is the only great benefit of having nuclear weapons. Because of nuclear weapons, when you have a contest between two great powers, both of whom has nuclear weapons, you don't get a winner and a loser, you get a loser and a loser. And that's why, even though the United States and Soviet Union had a massive geopolitical contest lasting over 40 years, they never came close to fighting a war directly with each other. Having said that, there were some close shaves, the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, both sides understood you don't fight each other directly, right? And so that at the end of the day, I don't think there will be an all-out military war between the United States and China. But I have to give a small exception here, and the exception is the issue of Taiwan. Because there is, in life we have mostly uncertainties. But some areas we have certainties. It's a certainty that the US-China contest will accelerate. And it's also a certainty that the day after Taiwan declares independence, for whatever reason, China will declare war. 100% certainty, right? No Chinese leader, after China's century of humiliation, can see the permanent secession of Taiwan from China. And so it's very important for us to know this to prevent war over Taiwan. And here, one of my big worries is that the people of Taiwan are not being well educated by their leaders on how dangerous the situation in Taiwan can be and how in this very rough and dangerous games of geopolitics, and as you know, geopolitics in some ways is like a game of chess. In a game of chess, you easily sacrifice a pawn if it gives you an advantage. Taiwan is a pawn, Taiwan can be sacrificed. And the people of Taiwan must get to know this, because if they don't, they'll be sacrificed. And again, in the Q&A we can discuss some of that. And so, at the end of the day, the best thing we can do on Taiwan is to preserve the status quo. But as you can see with the visits by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, there are some forces who want to create trouble across the Taiwan Straits. And even Tom Friedman of New York Times described her visit as dangerous, reckless, and irresponsible. And that was it. So the Taiwan issue is a dangerous issue, and that could start a conflict. But apart from that, I think there will be no conflict between the United States and China. So where will the conflict, where will the contests play out? Well, I would say it will be in the economic dimension, the political dimension, social dimension, cultural dimension. And I think probably the most important dimension will be the economic dimension. Because at the end of the day, one of the clear indicators of who has won this contest is who has the bigger economy, right? And the United States has had the world's largest economy since the 1890s, I think, 130 years, and was confident that it would always have the world's largest economy. But the projections show now that China can overtake the United States. But here too, by the way, what's interesting, about 10 years ago, there were so many projections saying that that China would overtake the United States by the late 2020s, in 4 to 5 years from now. Now no one makes that projection. So the United States has also bounced back significantly, right? And what's remarkable is that even though the US economy has had many challenges, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the COVID crisis, the US economy continues to perform very well. And recently when I was reading The Economist, I was very surprised to come across this statistic, that, you know, the seven most, I guess, among the 7 largest economies of the world are the members of the G7, right? The United States, Germany, France, UK, Italy, I'm not sure whether Spain is there, EU, members of Japan is there. And it's a remarkable statistic is that since when the G7 was founded, the United States share of the G7 GNP was only 40%. Now, the US share of the G7 has grown to 60%. That's amazing. It shows the US economy is still growing very powerfully. So even though the growth rates of China are clearly faster, this is normal. A country with lower per capita income will of course grow faster than a country with a higher per capita income. The US economy has been performing very well. And if you read, of course, the Anglo-Saxon media, and here, just as an aside, let me say, I find that whenever I have to do research on US-China issues, don't trust the Anglo-Saxon media. They will tell you everything that is wrong about China, but they'll never tell you one thing that's right about China. And if you read the Anglo-Saxon media, you always keep wondering, why hasn't China collapsed yet? Because they keep predicting the collapse of China. And of course, the latest prediction is that China can no longer succeed economically. In fact, when I was recently in the US talking to various people, in fact, this is public information, I'm not revealing anything, even some of the more enthusiastic bulls on the Chinese economy, I'll give you two examples, very good economists, and very good people actually, Stephen Roach of Yale and Bill Overholt of Harvard. They used to be China bulls, and now they've become China bears. And the reason why they've become China bears is because they believe that China has retreated from its pro-reform agenda that it used to have. China is moving towards greater control of the economy, state economy, and therefore China, which used to be a dynamic, thriving economy, can no longer get high growth rates. And that seems to be the way the opinion is drifting in the Anglo-Saxon media's evaluation. They may well be right, can never tell, but I wouldn't place my bets on that. Because I do think that the Chinese leaders are acutely aware that this contest against US will accelerate. And the Chinese leaders are acutely aware that if China falls behind in the economic competition, China has lost the game. And so come what may, they have to revive the economic growth of China for the sake of sheer national survival. And of course, as you know, there's all kinds of theories as to whether or not the reformers won or the reformers lost after the last party congress. You can have debates all night on it, but I do think that the reform agenda of China will continue. And of course, you have to, at the end of the day, look at evidence. And here, I think the best evidence of China's commitment to reform is how the Chinese economy still remains open to the rest of the world. And here, when future historians write about this contest, they will be puzzled that on the one hand is the United States that taught the world the benefits of the theories of free trade and so on and so forth, right? All the theories we learned from the Americans and the Westerners. I mean, Adam Smith was not Chinese, but yet today, amazingly, the United States is incapable of signing an FTA with any country, and China is prepared to sign an FTA with anybody. And the consequence of that is that the global trade with China has grown dramatically. Today, China is the world's #1 trading power. United States is behind. And 120 countries in the world do more trade with China. And if that trend continues, surely that would be a competitive advantage for China. And maybe later in the Q&A, Paul, I can give you some specific statistics also about China and ASEAN and how that illustrates the changes that are happening. So clearly you can see that in the economic dimension, the United States has performed well, China has performed well, and therefore this is a race between two remarkable horses. And it's very difficult to say which horse is going to win this economic contest. Then we come to the political dimension. And here I would say, if you go to the United States and you say, who's going to win the contest between US and China in the political dimension, you say, what's the contest? Democracies always win, as you know. And in theory they should. Democracies are open, flexible political systems, changing and adapting. If a leader doesn't perform, he's thrown out in elections, a new leader comes in, and therefore democracies will always outperform an autocracy or a dictatorship. And so they say in the contest between a democracy in the United States and a communist party system in China, of course, a democracy would win. And it's impossible to find anyone who questions that assumption in the United States. But here too, if you dig a bit deeper, as I tried to do in, I think, chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won? I say functionally, if you study how the American political system operates and how the Chinese political system operates, beneath the surface, what you see is something quite different. So the United States, for example, functionally has gone from being a democracy towards becoming a plutocracy. Now this is a very fundamental change. I want to emphasize I'm not the only one saying this. The late Paul Volcker said this, the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz says this, Martin Wolf says this. And the danger of becoming a plutocracy is that decisions are made in the society not to benefit 100% of the people, but to benefit the top 10 to 20% only. And the data therefore shows that in the United States, actually the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has remained stagnant for decades, and other social indicators indicate lots of problems in the society. Life expectancy has come down. This never happens in developed societies. And, if you look at the poverty rates and what Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate, called deaths by despair, they're rising in the United States. So the United States, in that sense, is not a well-functioning democracy. And that's why, as a result of there being so much anger in the body politic, you get populism surfacing, Donald Trump winning the elections in 2016, and let's hope he doesn't win in 2024. Unfortunately, the chances of him winning are not zero. They're low, 20-30% maybe, but they're not zero. So I just can't imagine coming back to Hong Kong to giving a speech when Donald Trump is president. It will be a strange world if he comes back to us. So that's on the United States side. And on the Chinese side, functionally, the Chinese political system has become what I call a meritocracy. And meritocracy is one where the best people are chosen to serve in positions of leadership in the society. And as you know, in the United States, you can be completely unqualified and you can become president, exhibit A, Donald Trump. But in China, it's impossible. In China, if you haven't run a province, if you haven't done some serious assignments, you will not be given greater responsibilities. So therefore, you can see that the quality of leadership and quite often the quality of mind of the leaders within the Chinese political system is actually quite remarkable today. And so therefore, instead of it being a contest just purely between democracy and a communist party system, it's actually a contest between a meritocracy and a plutocracy. And then we have to see which society performs better. And if you look at the social indicators, which are a very key indicator, you will see that the social indicators in many ways, the societal improvements in China are quite remarkable and actually have been remarkable over the last 30 to 40 years. And China, as you know, has just more people out of poverty than any other human since human history began. So this is why the contest and the political dimension is also very complex. Now let me just race through, because I know the clock's ticking, the other dimensions that, of course, I have to emphasize that what happens in the science and technology dimension is also very, very critical. And here you can see that in theory, China should have a numerical advantage. It has got 1.4 billion people. They can harvest the best brains from 1.4 billion people. China every year produces much greater number of scientists and engineers than the United States does. But amazingly, this is one area where the United States may have a major competitive advantage, because the United States can harvest the best brains, not just from 330 million people in the United States, but from 8 billion people around the world. And that's why some of the most successful American corporations are run by people not born in the United States. Google is run by Sundar Pichai, born in India. Microsoft is run by Satya Nadella, born in India. And you can see, therefore, it's a huge mistake to underestimate the United States in this dimension. And I can tell you, up to 2-3 years ago, when I used to go to conferences like this, everyone would say, hey, on AI, China is obviously going to win. China's got access to massive amount of data. They don't have controls on data. With a huge pool of data, China will win the race in AI. And then, of course, the United States produces ChatGPT. This is the thing about the United States. Okay? It does remarkable things. And so, again, in the contest in the science and technology dimension, it'd be a mistake to think that one side or the other will do very well. And that's where clearly some of the most intense competition will take place. And that's why you can notice that one of the things that the US administration has actually created a clear policy is to deny China access to the best technology. And that's why the CHIPS Act was passed recently. And there will be, by the way, other such measures coming. I don't know which ones. I cannot spy inside what's going on in the US government, but I have no doubt that more such measures will continue, and that's going to be a crucial dimension. So you can see, therefore, the contest will take place in dimension after dimension after dimension. So all this, let me, and we can of course go into greater elaboration on these points when we come to the Q&A with Paul. But I want to conclude by asking the question, is there a wiser way of managing this US-China contest? And I actually believe that there is a wiser way of managing it, this US-China contest, and that is what I try to do in the last chapter of my book, Has China Won? And to point out that in many ways, in the area of geopolitics, we should recognize that we are no longer in the 19th century or the 20th century, where countries were, separated by great distances, and countries had independent destinies. Because the world has transformed dramatically. Now, how do I describe this fundamental transformation of the world? I use a boat analogy. And what I say, in the past, when 8 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 93 separate boats, right? If you're in a different boat, what happens in another boat doesn't matter. So if one boat catches COVID, the other boat won't catch COVID, because COVID cannot travel from boat to boat, right? But the world has shrunk. Today, when 8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, they're no longer living in 193 separate boats. They're living in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. You want proof? One cabin gets COVID, all 193 cabins get COVID. It's a small, interdependent world. And the challenges that we face in the common boat are becoming far more important. Not just COVID, you have climate change. And climate change is going to accelerate. And no one country can solve climate change, right? You have to get, especially the two biggest countries, US and China, to cooperate. So there are now different imperatives that are pushing down on us. And therefore, I do hope that if we all speak out on this issue, the big message we should combine as humanity tell policymakers in both Beijing and Washington, D.C. The message we should say is that our common concerns as humanity today are far more important. Let's stop all these 19th century geopolitical struggles. Let's work together to save planet Earth. And then after we've done that, then we can go back to fighting again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mahbubani. Ladies and gentlemen, the lunch will be served soon. The Q&A session will start in 30 minutes. Thank you.